Hello and welcome to On the Real Side. I'm your host, Bob Mover, and very happy today to have a wonderful guest that is a little bit outside of the kind of guest we've had before, but an equally fascinating man by the name of Lewis Porter. Hi, Lewis.
Hi, Bob. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. To explain a little bit about Lewis, Lewis is one of the great jazz scholars. He's also a fine piano player. Let's start with that. And that kind of informs his jazz writing because many people that write about jazz don't have the experience of like actually playing it. So that is one of the things that has made him one of the leading jazz historians of our day, maybe the leading historian. Uh, I don't think of Lewis as a critic because I haven't really read criticism. And I think being a musician, we'll talk about that. He might eschew that, but I know he's more involved with the history of the music. And I myself have learned a lot about the history of the music from reading some of Lewis's writings and from having nice discussions with my friend Lewis about our mutual love of this music. So I have a biography here, which I'm happy to have because, like a lot of my friends, I never really got to discuss with them the little factors of what they did, what led to what in their life, and the sequential events. And there's a way that they put this in here. There's a couple of interesting things in the bio. One thing is I like this that as a historian, Lewis is noted for the breadth of his knowledge on all areas and aspects of jazz, as well as related musical, social, and historical matters of context. In particular, he is known for bringing to everything his original research and a point of view. And this is what I underline here, often inspiring listeners and readers to rethink received wisdom. So before we get into your personal story and history, we'll get into all that and everything. I'm curious about that sentence. Like what received, I have an idea what that might mean to me, but how would you define received wisdom?
That's interesting. I wonder who I wonder who wrote that. But it's funny because maybe 1990 something, somebody wrote about me. He's the watchdog. I think of him as the watchdog of jazz history. I said, well, I hope I'm not a pit bull of jazz history because I don't want to be wounding people. But it's funny because my attitude or the way my mind works is whenever I hear something said is I think about it, and I say, well, I wonder if that really makes sense. So when they say received wisdom, they mean the stuff that people, I guess you would say, receive unquestioningly. And so even currently in my series it's called Playback with Lewis Porter, my series of essays on Substack, everybody always says Miles was such a thief. He stole tunes. I showed with obviously tons of research and documentation that first of all, it's almost always, now see, you probably have experience with this, Bob, it's almost always the record label, the record company that gives the credit and that has the copyright. And I checked all these tunes that supposedly Miles stole. Prestige Records owns them. They're not owned by Miles Davis. Why did they give Miles the credit? That's a long story, but basically it's better for them financially to say this tune is by Miles Davis. You have to read my essay. But the point is, that's received wisdom. Everybody says that. They say, oh, everybody knows Miles stole tunes. I say, well, that's actually not. If you look at the copyright records, it's not the case. So the way my mind works is I always think about things. So, for example, when they said he stole tunes, I said, what does that even mean? What do you do? Grab the lead sheet and run out of the studio as fast as you can? I mean, there has to be a process by which that tune gets credited to Miles Davis. how would that happen? You
Well,
see?
that's funny because I knew Cleanhead, for example.
Yeah, that's a
And,
good example.
I used to sit in with Cleanhead Vincent, and
Great.
and Eddie would. It's funny. He never expressed any animosity or anger toward Miles. He just said, by the way, he said, I didn't just write tune up. I wrote four.
That's right. Four and tune up. Yeah.
He wrote those two. He said, but the record companies, that's all he said. He said the record companies, it was easy for them to get the publishing. They never talked to me. They just went right through Miles because he did that. So another thing I always wondered about
That's
too.
interesting that he understood that, because not all cats do. But that's exactly what happens, because Miles was under contract to them. It's a long story. You can read the essay, but basically, if they credit it to an artist who's under contract to them, it works out better for them than trying to find Cleanhead Vincent, who's not under contract, and give him some money. You
Right.
see?
And plus there were like Bob Weinstock, for example, who I think had a lot to do that
Absolutely.
label. I mean, Phil Woods used to talk about this guy like he was the devil in the flesh.
They,
I mean,
apparently, he was like a Jewish gangster, so to speak.
he was, Phil. I mean, Phil had nothing. As Jill once described Phil's wife, once described Phil, and she said Phil is a very angry man, but he's angry about all the right things.
Ah, that's good. That's good.
And so, but I remember Phil talking about he had a short contract with Prestige, and made a
That's
couple of
right.
nice records, Warm Woods and the Phil and Quill stuff and all that was on Prestige. But he said he got nothing from
Wow.
Prestige. There was like no royalties, nothing, like an initial scale for the date or something, and that was all
Yeah.
he saw.
And
Then,
those were the days when people actually bought records, so there should have been something. He should have gotten something for them.
yeah,
You
you
know.
would think there would be. So now the other thing with Miles is just I always wondered, and this is my own speculation. But I mean, I'm sure this is what happened. It was the company that gave Miles the credit on Solar, even though Chuck Wayne had actually, who was the
That's right.
actual composer, had recorded it first.
Well, that's a little tricky. That's actually the tune I used as my example, and it took me several. There's a part one, part two, part three. I went on and on with it.
So my
But
question to you is that,
what happened is Chuck only made a demo. He never put it out, number one. Number two, he didn't copyright it. So unfortunately, he left himself open for that. But once again, it was the record label. That's Prestige Records again. That was
and one
Prestige.
other factor that I think doesn't get considered in that, which I thought of, was I did hear Chuck Wayne's demo recording of it,
Okay.
and the first change he uses in there is C major.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
Miles changed that first chord to C minor major seventh,
Yes.
which gives the whole tune a different character.
Exactly. So you can
Uh,
legitimately say, you could say Miles arranged it, if you will, but I think it's a better chord too. I agree with you.
You
You know,
know,
it's more interesting. And
yeah,
Miles was kind of a brilliant arranger. He took a lot of people's tunes and had his own arrangements, but crediting the tune to him is Prestige. And guess who owns the copyright? Prestige Records, not Miles Davis. So people who are watching this, get over your idea that Miles stole. The other thing I found out in my research, there are just as many tunes falsely credited to people like John Coltrane, who nobody says is a thief, and other well-known, well-respected musicians that are credited by the record labels. So there's nothing particularly like Miles's track record. I would say it's a little worse than some other artists, but it's in the ballpark. You're talking about maybe 7 tunes. It's in the ballpark of how many tunes are wrongly credited to other people as well. So, as far as to get back to the big issue, the whole thing about questioning received wisdom, that's just the way my brain works. Say, gee, I wonder if that really makes sense. And then I start looking into it.
well, you're another place where you are definitely a strong voice is in the area of jazz education, because you have started some jazz education programs at places like Tufts and somewhere else as well. It's in my notes here.
Yeah, Brandeis. People
Brandeis, that's right.
people don't know this, but I was the first jazz teacher and jazz band director at Tufts. That started in January of '77, and then about 2 years later, in the fall of '79, I started working on my PhD in music at Brandeis, and they uh, said, as far as kind of my as part of my financial package, they asked me, would you be capable of and willing to start a big band here? We don't even have a big band. We just have a lot of student interest. Now, this is the funny part. I said, well, sure. I mean, I'll have to put, in those days, you put flyers around campus, and I'd have to choose a day for the auditions and all this. But sure, if is there really that much interest? Oh, yeah, we're constantly hearing from students. How come we don't have a jazz band? I swear to you, the end of this meeting, I said, this was with Dr. Bent, who was the chair of music. I said, but excuse me, but where's the bathroom? She said, it's right downstairs. So the meeting's over. I go to the bathroom, and all over the bathroom, including inside the stalls, there is graffiti saying, "We want a jazz band."
Really?
So I said, well, she definitely is telling the truth. If these students are putting it in the bathroom,
The bathroom's wall.
they're desperate. They're desperate for a jazz band.
That's, but so the issue of jazz education. One thing that I've found, and I'm sure you've seen it too. This when I thought about the idea of received wisdom, and was thinking about it on my own. I was thinking about how things have gotten so codified that, for instance, there are in most jazz programs, and one of the reasons that there may be so little originality among some of the young jazz players. They're very competent and very technically adept, and all that, and the knowledge is there. But I think they're taught that there were like 5 piano players, and that comprises the history of jazz, 5 to 10 people on each instrument. You don't say, like, if when I'm there and I say, well, everybody of course knows Coltrane and most people know the name Sonny Rollins and they've heard him. But if I say, Johnny Griffin, about 3 hands raised, and somebody says, "Oh, he's on a Monk record," isn't he? And
Yeah, right. That's right.
but they don't realize that there's like at least 100, probably around 100 Johnny Griffin records, and and then if you mention Don Byron, there might be 2 people that know that.
And he was an amazing player too.
Yeah, but I mean, just as far as even piano players, it's like there's a history. It went from Earl Hines, who very few people even they know him as a name.
Hines is that's one of my pet peeves, because Hines is one of my all-time favorites, and he's one of the, especially on solo piano. I always tell people, get some of his later records where he stretches out on solo piano, plays like for 10 minutes on a tune. It's
Earl
unbelievable. What's
Remember
that?
Earl Hines at Home?
Oh yeah, that's a nice one. And
nice
it's amazing. He's the only guy that will actually go into different keys, and anything can happen when he plays solo, and there's absolutely no awareness of him at all.
Yeah, that's that's such a terrible thing. I mean, I used to hear him in New York in a quartet that he had with Bud Johnson.
Oh man, I loved Bud Johnson. I used to see Bud around New York, and I did see Earl Hines play once, but it was after Bud left. It was 70 something. Rudy Rutherford, exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, those were the cats. That was now we didn't really know each other. You kind of came around, at least on the scene in the 80s, I think, in New York. You were kind of and I left at the end, early 80s. I kind of left New York for a number of years. Played a lot in Europe, and
that's right.
But I know that there was that whole West End grill scene, and where Phil Schaap was up there, and Lawrence Schoenberg, and you guys would hang out at Brooks Kerr, my dear friend Brooks.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Was also up there, and that place supplied a kind of real refuge for the microcosm of swing musicians that were
Absolutely.
that were
There
around.
was a tenor player up there, Franz Jackson. Is that his last name? Franz
I've heard of him.
Jackson, maybe. Quiet as it's kept, the guy sounds great. He's kind of a Coleman Hawkins type player, but really makes the changes,
Wow.
excellent.
Well, there
And
was
then, of
George
course,
Kirby and some guys like that too.
yeah, and of course, all the Basie alums, so to speak. Well, I basically grew up I wasn't born in the Bronx. I was born in Scranton, PA, but I basically grew up in the Bronx. But just the way life happened, I ended up living in Boston from 74 to 86, with obviously frequent trips back to New York, but I missed a lot of that West End stuff because of that, although, of course, I did. I was there several times in the audience. And so that's probably why you and I didn't intersect as much. I think my Boston years were not the same as your Boston years, or maybe there's some overlap.
Right, 74 till 80, really. I was in New York, actually
Okay,
from 72. Again, I had been in Boston for a couple of years between 69 and 72.
okay,
And then I went to New York and stayed pretty much the whole rest of the 70s until about 1980. Then I
okay.
came back to Boston in 1980 and did 3 semesters at Berkeley.
And I kind of remember in the early 80s, because I was still up there, I kind of remember you being on the scene then. And it's possible we ran into each other or were in the same room at one time.
Yeah, you might have, I played at those, I had Michael's and, in
Right,
Grove Street and Who's Pub and some of the
right.
places around Boston. Joe Cohn was in my quartet, and Bobby Ward. That's what
Oh, Bobby Ward,
Bobby
that's
Ward
a great drummer. I
was.
used to do a lot of stuff with Joe Cohn. Of course, he's an amazing player and kind of a character. And that's for those of you watching. That's the son of the famous tenor player Al Cohn. And we did a number of gigs, maybe 84 and 85, with Alan Dawson on drums, which was great. And do you remember Whit Brown?
Whit Brown and Alan always played together.
That's right. Yeah,
They
they
were a
were
real
kind of a
team.
team.
In fact, I was in a band with Art Matthews, the piano player.
Oh, he was terrific.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, he had when I was teaching at Berkeley, I taught 3 semesters at Berkeley, and I believe that was 1981, 1980, 79, 80. That's right, something like that. And we had a quartet at a place called Tinkers,
Hmm.
which was a club
Rings a bell.
in the combat zone. It was a really nice club. We were the house band, and people like Junior Cook and Bill Hardman would play opposite us. And we did about 2 or 3 months there. And the club closed down when the owner got shot.
Oh my God. Again, for people watching, that's why they call that neighborhood the combat zone.
That's one of the reasons they
You
called
know,
it that.
you got to be
And
careful around there.
but the beauty of that band was it was Art, who's a fine pianist. He's still around, and
He's still around. I didn't know that. Good.
and the front line was Wallace Roney, who was 18 years old,
Oh my God.
and me. We were and Wallace was kind of a student of mine too at Berkeley, but we were in this band together. I thought about his peers, and Whit Brown and Alan Dawson
Oh my God, that's
were the
great.
bass and drums, and that quintet was burning.
I
Really.
bet.
I
Sounds
wrote a nice
terrific.
tune for Art Matthews, which I like the title of very much. I called it Art Matthews Passion.
Art Matthews Passion.
Yeah,
That's great.
like Matthews Passion.
That's great. Well, I started on piano. Piano's always been my instrument, but people always say, "Well, I noticed you writing about." My first book was Lester Young, and you wrote about Coltrane. Seems like you're more sax oriented. Well, I do love the sax, but I also love trombone. I rented a trombone when I was 15 one summer just to try it out. But brass is tough. I decided, that wasn't going to be my destiny. But
Trombone, I never could figure out. You know the old joke about that. They go, boom, 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 boom. It's all when the trombone players play. they're moving like within a circumference of a few inches, but when you watch them play slowly, those positions seem miles apart.
Exactly, and it's all about the positions and knowing what notes are possible here and there. So I gave up on that, but I did take up the alto. And during the early '80s, at most of my gigs, I brought that I had usually there was a piano there, or I would bring a keyboard. I had a Wurlitzer, and I
I have
brought
one of
my
those too.
alto. And part of the reason I worked with guitar players like Joe is because when I decided I'll play sax on the next number, it still felt full with a guitar player there, you know. But by the early '90s, my kids, my son and daughter were born, and I just couldn't handle that much practicing every day to be practicing piano and sax. I don't know how cats like Ira Sullivan did it, but he's great on two totally different instruments, trumpet and sax.
And flute.
So,
He
and
took up flute
that's
in
true.
the
He
30s.
was a marvelous flute player.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I finally decided in '94, actually, I said I can't handle trying to keep up the sax. It was always mostly piano, and of course today it's only piano. But I will say this, that I told George Garzone that I was giving up the alto, uh, and he wrote me back. This was it was after I gave up the alto. This was in already the texting era, and he texted me back. He said, "That's too bad. You sounded good on alto," because George and I did a bunch of gigs together at 1369, where it was tenor, alto, bass, and drums. Bob Galati and Larry Appleman, I think it was, or it might have been our friend from South Africa, that great bass player who's still around, John. I'm having
Not John
a
Lockwood.
John Lockwood, yeah. And so that was nice anyway to hear that I had something happening on the sax. But in my own judgment, I always, when you start an instrument when you're young, you always have a kind of an advantage. And on the piano, I always had that advantage of having played it when I was young.
So you started at 4, 5, 6 years old.
I
Yeah.
wasn't that young. I was about 10, but I didn't start sax until I was 19. So it was a big difference.
Did
Yeah.
you have a musical family? Did you have anybody?
I did not. We had an upright piano because my mom, when she was a young girl, she took piano lessons, and sometimes she would give piano lessons, and it was a source of income. She didn't do it much, but every once in a while she'd have a piano
She
student.
played well enough to give lessons.
That's right. Yeah, she did, and she knew how to read music. I mean, she definitely had some ability. But the funny thing is, I can't say like we heard her play much around the house. If there was a lesson, she played. If friends were over, she might play something. But so definitely she was musical, but it was something that by the time I was already, even when I was 10, she wasn't doing it much anymore. But I gravitated towards the piano, and I have to give my older brother credit. I have two siblings, an older and a younger brother. And my older brother, to this day, loves music. His greatest love is classical, but he's open-minded. It's not only classical. And he used to come home with LPs of all the great symphonies, and I just went crazy. I said, "Oh my God, I love music. I want to go into music. That's going to be my field."
You knew that.
I
You
knew
were
that
you were about 10 years old.
at the age of 10, I made that decision. I said, I'm going into music. Now, this is the funny thing. I was only just starting to really fool around on piano, and I had kind of a long story, but I also was started violin lessons at the age of 10. Because my brother was playing piano, my older brother, and I have to be honest, he didn't want the competition. So my mom said, my mom was divorced. She was raising the three boys as a single mom. And she kind of let my older brother be the boss. He was like the oldest young man in the family. So she said,
What age difference was there between you?
we're all about 2.5 years apart.
Close.
And so she actually asked my older brother in my presence. She said, maybe it looks like Louis is interested in the piano. He said, oh, no, he should be playing a different instrument. How about violin? Then we could play classical music together. Well, that never worked out because I actually, my teacher said I was doing great on the violin, but I didn't love it. I just didn't love playing it. I kept gravitating back to the piano. So that's how I got started anyway. And but I used to imagine, because I was just starting piano, I was just starting violin, so I used to imagine myself as a classical conductor. Why? Because I was 10 years old and I thought all you have to do is wave your arms around. How hard can that be?
Yeah. I thought of that, but I was 19.
Yeah, right.
But, thought of that. Well, if they don't want me in jazz because there was a lot of racial stuff going on, I said, well, maybe I'd like to be a classical conductor. That would be my second choice. I
That's a
wasn't going to
good.
play the saxophone and was going to do something else in music. I even did some piano reductions.
Wow,
Something that conductors do.
that's right.
The piano reduction of Mozart's Sinfonia Concertante,
Oh my God,
violin
that's
and
great.
viola in E flat.
Yep,
It's a beautiful piece, man.
it's an amazing piece. Yeah,
But
that's great.
so but when did jazz hit you?
So, as I mentioned, it was classical music for me at first, but so intensely that I knew that's what I wanted to go into. And but slowly, not maybe not so slowly, over the next couple of years, jazz started to come in my consciousness. Now it's funny because I
Did you
thought I was there.
transition to rock and roll? I'm sorry, anything?
Yeah, but that's a good point. Yes, at my age, I was born in 51 and 63, 64. That was exactly the right time for the Beatles. Oh my
Right.
God, I loved the
Great.
Beatles. Yeah, absolutely. But
Go
the
ahead.
jazz started to come into my consciousness. First, in sixth grade, I remember the music teacher. We used to have an assembly, and the music teacher would teach different things. And one day he said, "Today I'm going to teach you about jazz." Now, here's a recording by Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. It might have been Sure Enough. I'm not, and I remember turning. There was a little boy next to me in the sixth grade who was a big classical music fan. We used to talk about classical. Oh, did you hear this one? Did you hear that one? And so I remember turning to him. I said, "What do you think of that?" He said, "I think it's pretty good." I said, "Yeah." And I was like amazed because, here was this other music that was really good.
Did he
But
mention there was Rimsky-Korsakov?
oh, that's true. Yeah, or maybe
The
that's a little bit
Saber
like
dance,
this.
isn't it?
It's Khachaturian, the saber
Victorian,
dance.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry, yeah.
and but it was just kind of starting to filter in. I hadn't made any decisions yet. Then I started watching when I was 11, 12. Peter Gunn, the detective show on TV.
Absolutely.
Now, Peter Gunn had jazz continuously. If you've seen the episodes online, those of you that are watching this, watch any Peter Gunn show. There is jazz playing from the minute the show starts till the minute it ends, either in the background or in the foreground, because one of the things that the character Peter Gunn used to do is wander into a jazz club now and then,
Right.
where Shelly Manne was playing with Larry Bunker on vibes and all these different West Coast cats,
Was Mancini the composer to a
And
lot
it
of
was
that?
all music of
Well,
Henry
Mancini.
Mancini, except for
Yeah.
the solos, of course, but a lot of blues themes and stuff. And I loved it. I bought the albums. I didn't recognize the names at the time. Years later, I looked at the album. Art Pepper, Jack Sheldon,
Yeah.
Jimmy Rolls on piano, who I love. I later got to talk to Rolls, of course, years later. So it was starting to filter in, filter in. Then finally, crazy story, my older brother came up to me one day when I was 14, and he said, I'm pretty sure I was 14, and he said, I'm going to join this club that they keep advertising, the Columbia House Record Club. It says you get 10 records for a penny or something like that to start off with. Of course, after that, they raise the prices every month. But he said, it seems like a good deal, but they have a list. You have to choose from the list. I found 9 albums I want. I can't find 10. He's very particular. He wanted certain classical albums. I said, wait a second, they have Girl from Ipanema. I saw somebody singing that on TV. That's a really nice song. Let's give that a try. Turns out it was the famous Stan Getz album.
It's Gilberto.
With Gilberto singing and with Jobim himself on piano.
Right.
and with
The
a
orange and
Brazilian.
black cover.
Yep, and it was actually an all Brazilian band except for Getz. And the minute it came, it happened. My brother wasn't home from school yet, so I said, "Oh, this album is mine." I opened the box. Well, that's mine. I'm allowed to put it on. I put it on, and I went crazy over the saxophone playing. I listened to side one. Oh my God, this is incredible. I listened to side two. This is unbelievable. By the time my brother came home, I was listening to side one again, and I said, I love this album, but especially this saxophone playing. What is this? What's going on here? My brother said, I don't know if that's called Brazilian music or what you would call it. He said, let me look it up. He had the Schwann catalog, which was the catalog of all records in print. And he said, Getz, I can't find him. I don't see him under this. Oh, here he is. He's under jazz. I said, if he's under jazz, that's the music I'm going into, is jazz music. I decided that day it wasn't going to be classical. It was going to be jazz.
Isn't that funny? Because I had a very similar experience with that, because Stan Getz, if you don't know, that's who we're talking about, because we actually haven't mentioned him, but he's the guy with the bossa nova, because we have people listening to the show who may not have an idea about what we're talking about. So if you didn't know, it's Stan Getz. I had a very similar experience, and that was one of the first records that I got to. My parents had one record with him on it, which was for musicians only.
Oh, yeah, that's a nice one.
But everything was so fast, that it was, I mean, I could kind of keep up with it. And I like the fact, because, see, I heard Lester Young first.
Okay.
My own particular experience was I had a best friend, and we used bars, and we would play. I was 10, 11 years old, and we would play, like everything from the Everly Brothers. We sang everything in harmony.
Yeah, that's great.
Buddy Holly, and then Little Richard, and some of those things, and the more
fantastic
rhythm and blues. But then he got killed. He got hit by a car.
Ooh, that's terrible.
Yeah, and I was just 11 and almost 12, and I couldn't even play the guitar anymore.
Oh my
nor
God.
could I listen to the rock and roll. And the Beatles had just come in, but we were writing each other letters, and he was crazy about the Beatles, and he said we could be like them and write songs, and that was my dream, to be with Harold and to do these kind of things. And then, to make a long story short, I was so depressed over this tragedy.
Wow.
And feeling that when something like that happens that nobody understands, and I couldn't listen to rock and roll because it would just make me cry.
Wow.
So I found a record in my parents' collection. I've told this story before, so I'll make it short. I found Blue Lester. This guy in a pinstripe suit with a horn held at that famous angle.
Right.
And when I heard Blue Lester, I had this epiphany. I heard da 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 do ba da dee da 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 dee da do.
That's right. On Savoy Records.
Yeah. That was like, exactly, with that red cover. It was like the minor, the sadness, da da da, and the sun comes out. It goes into major. And listening to Lester play and something about the sound he got, I said, this guy understands the kind of sadness and loneliness I'm feeling.
That's amazing.
So from there, I was just crazy. I found Lester Young records. And then Billie Holiday, of course, I discovered her. And I discovered my mother Sinatra records, because he also had that kind of feeling.
Absolutely.
And then there were a couple of other records that did that to me. But, I was still just trying to play. I was like, I didn't know what I wanted to play. I didn't want to play guitar anymore. I was messing with drums. And then I heard Stan Getz, and when I heard the Bossa Nova record, too, then I could really hear the lyricism, that something special that he brought to the music, that he wasn't just a white Jewish guy imitating black people, though there was a lot of Lester Young in him.
Yeah.
I could feel the lineage, but yet it seemed like, wow, there's room for me in here.
That's interesting.
Because I heard Bird, and I had all these things, but they were all black people. And Stan was the first white guy, a Jewish guy like me, and he was doing this. So I think you and I have that kind of similar kind of thing. In some way, I know you didn't think of it probably racially that way, but here was this guy playing it, and you might have noted that he was also a landsman, a Jewish fellow.
At that moment, I didn't know, because I was just listening to it, although there may have been some photos inside on the album. But that's amazing that you reacted to him too. There's one solo in particular on that album, on the song So Danso
Soldato
Samba,
Samba.
which
Yes.
is, he double times. That is not the quiet, mellow Stan Getz. He double times. He plays, it's absolutely brilliant. I played that for my grad students, and they always go, "Oh my God, I didn't even know he could play like that,"
That's
because people today don't know about Getz so much as they, at one time he was the top of the polls in the late 50s, from about 57 to 62, were Getz, Coltrane, Rollins, Coltrane not yet in 57, but over those years, Getz, Coltrane, Rollins, he was right up there with them. And the late Amiri Baraka told me that in the black community, he grew up in Newark, of course, he said Stan Getz attracted a big black audience because they felt, well, he's one white cat who really's got soul. He really can play.
as did Chet Baker.
And Chet, yeah.
When I would play with Chet and we would play in Detroit, we'd have an audience that was like maybe at least 70% black.
That's interesting.
And, which was a very interesting thing. And
yeah, Chet was a great player. But the funny thing is, I never thought about being a teacher. I never planned on being a teacher. I fell into it. It's almost like I tripped over a doorstep and ended up in a classroom. And my mentor, in terms of my entire academic career, is a black composer named T.J. Anderson, who is going to be 96 on August 17th. And I call him every now and then, and we talk, and I still call him my mentor because he's the one who saw something in me. He said, that's great that you play. I understand that your goal is to be a player, but you have something. You have something as a scholar and as a teacher. And I wasn't even thinking that. I was thinking at the most I would teach, on a very part-time basis,
What's his story? I saw it in here, in the fall of 1977, while working on his MA in music, under his mentor, Professor T.J. Anderson, which is the next thing that I had underlined here.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Became the first faculty director. What's a little bit about Mr. Anderson's background?
So TJ, as everybody calls him, and I call him too, he's born in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, which is not too far from Philadelphia, in 1928, August 17th. And he played trumpet, he did gigs, but he very early on gravitated towards composition. And his style of composition is, some people were surprised because he's a lifelong jazz fan, but his style of composition is definitely more 12-tone serial music, avant-garde,
Oh, he was a black man?
He is, yeah.
I'm sorry, he is a black.
He's a black guy. And so people were kind of surprised, he's not trying to do the blues in his music or anything like that, but he sometimes does very kind of experimental juxtapositions. So, for example, he has a piece for solo trombone called Minstrel Man. He did 1 hour or maybe 45-minute long minstrel show using a combination of ragtime and avant-garde classical that he wrote for the Tufts Jazz Band, which I directed. Because the way we got affiliated, he was the head of the music department at Tufts. And I, again, this could be a long story, but I was listening to the radio one day. I had moved to Boston to be with my girlfriend in 74. And I was listening to Tufts University radio because college radio is where all the jazz was still. I mean, WKCR in New York, it's Columbia College Radio, Columbia University. So
WTBS in Boston, the MIT station.
Yep, they have jazz. And so all of a sudden I'm listening to the Tufts station and they come on and say, public service announcement, we're looking for one time we're asking people in the community we're not going to hire you as faculty, but just one course, something different, something that we wouldn't normally offer. And this is the funny thing is I can't remember thinking it over. I remember going straight to the telephone and dialing the number. A woman who was a dean there, Robin Gittleman, a great person who's now retired, with her husband Saul, who's a famous person at Tufts. If you ask anybody about Saul Gittleman, he was eventually the provost, but he was also a very popular teacher. Anyway, she picked up the phone and I said, I just heard that announcement and I really believe I could do a good job on a jazz history class. She said, really? That sounds interesting. Because in those days, unlike today, when every school has a jazz history class, or every college at least, they did not in those days. This was fall of '76, and she hired me to teach a jazz history course starting January '77. TJ, this was in the music department, so he used to walk up and down the hall, and I didn't know that sometimes he would pass the door and then stand just past the doorway and listen to me. And one day he called me and he said, here, come here, come here. I said, what? He said, I've been listening to you in the hallway. He said, you didn't see me because I didn't stand right in the doorway. I said, oh, well, I hope it was okay. He said, okay. He said, you know a lot about jazz history and you have a good way of explaining things. He said, why haven't you thought about being a full-time music teacher or having a full-time? I said, because I just want to play. And there's a whole other story of how it took him literally about 2 years to persuade me to go into an academic career. But I owe him a lot because it turned out to be a good fit and I hadn't even thought of it, you know.
Yeah, and your music didn't suffer, which was, I don't think, I mean.
Well, that's an interesting story because people always say to me, how did you manage to keep both careers going? And the truth is, I didn't really. What I did was kind of alternate. So for a while, when I was working on my Coltrane book, for example, my chops really were not flourishing. But as soon as the book was done, then I practiced like a demon and got myself back up to snuff. And I actually made a decision about 15 years ago that I'm not doing any more books because to finish a short essay, a lot of writers follow my series on Substack, and they will relate to this. You can finish a short essay and do a really satisfying job on it and feel good about it in a week or 2 weeks, whatever. But to finish a book, you need literally months of time, of dedicated time. And so I finally decided that's it for books. I'm not doing any more, just these short essays that I'm putting online.
Well, I know what
And
you
what
mean.
and the
I'm doing my
result, by the way,
memoirs
is
now.
well, I'm sorry.
I said, I kind of know what you mean. I'm writing my memoirs with a friend
Okay.
who's an accomplished writer himself, and this is the one book I have in me. I'm not gonna. It takes a long time and a lot of effort. So I mean, just doing this one, there's no more.
Exactly.
That's it.
And what was I going to say about that? So I made that decision. No more books, but I'm okay doing short essays. Those I can do. And the result has been that my chops on the piano are better than they've ever been. And everybody's been telling me that too. So I feel good about that. I feel good about having made that decision.
Found that balance. Yeah. Well, musical studies. That was your academic studies. Let's say T.J. Anderson being a huge influence that way. When you were in Boston, did you get next to Madame Shaloff or Charlie Benai or Ray Santisi? Who were your mentors as a piano player?
Yeah, well, that's another crazy story. I resisted lessons. When I was 10, I mentioned that my brother was already studying the piano. He was studying with a middle-aged German Jewish lady with an accent who was very strict. And when he was taking his lessons in the apartment, I would hear this, no, no, no. And so, but I just liked to fool around on the piano by ear. And one day my mom came up to me after the teacher left. She said, the teacher was just talking with me. I said, yeah, what about? She said, she saw you fooling around on the piano And she said, "This kid has talent. I want to give him lessons." And so my mom said, "Do you want lessons?" I said, "Not with her," because I heard that. I said, "I don't want that." So I resisted lessons, and I continued to resist lessons from. I started fooling around at 10. I gave up the violin at 12, and then it was only the piano. And it wasn't until I got to college at the University of Rochester, and I finally had a year of lessons, my junior year of college, with a teacher at the Eastman School of Music, classical teacher. Now, people ask me who was it. I couldn't tell you. It's someone who it wasn't their top teacher, because I was, someone who hadn't even had lessons before. But I did audition on classical piece by Clementi, and I got in. And it could be another long story, but the bottom line is, then I started studying. So I had a year of piano lessons. In graduate school, I had another year of lessons. Since then, I've taken lessons, isolated lessons as an adult, I'm talking about in the 90s, with Andy Laverne, Steve Kuhn, one lesson, Edna Golansky, who some people will know is a Madame Chaloff type, Sophia Rosoff, who a lot of people know is a Madame Chaloff type, like a guru type teacher. Sophia Rosoff is the one who taught Barry Harris, Fred Hirsch, and Ethan Iverson, and a few other people. I take an occasional lesson with a guru. So the truth is, as a pianist, I'm mostly self-taught to this day, but I was very good at getting the information I needed from the teachers that I had. Now get this, my junior year, I had a year of piano lessons. By that point, now I'm kind of hooked in with the Eastman School, which is owned by University of Rochester. So there was free registration. In other words, you could take a course at the Eastman School as a University of Rochester student. It's part of the same school. I see there's a combo class. I show up the first day of combo class. I walk through the main building of Eastman, those of you know the building, to the annex building. You kind of go through the building and across the street. Who's the teacher? A young trumpeter named Chuck Mangione.
Really?
And when I studied with Chuck for a semester, and when I tell people this next thing, they're always amazed. Chuck was a marvelous teacher. He was very supportive of me. And I
feel so good stuff. And
that was just before he hit it big with "Feel So Good." The album was Chuck Mangione and Friends, and it was just before Chuck Mangione and Friends. It was literally the end of that semester. I think that album just came out and became this kind of underground hit.
I remember also before he did that, he had that Jazz Brothers group with his brother Gap, which had Salnistico.
Exactly.
And Roy McCurdy.
When I was studying with him, he was known as a kind of hardcore jazz player. And during that semester, I went to see Pat Martino play at Duffy's Tavern in Rochester, and with Gene Ludwig on organ and the drummer, I don't remember. Guess who sat in? Chuck Mangione sat in on flugelhorn playing standards, and he sounded great, But beyond that, he was a terrific teacher and very supportive, and he could tell I was self-taught because I was playing everything by ear. And once in the middle of class, he said to everyone, it was an interesting class because there was a classical oboe player who wanted to learn jazz, and a trumpet, no sax, myself, bass and drums. And Chuck said to me once in the middle of class, he said, your solo wing is excellent, but if I asked you, why did you play that over this chord, you probably couldn't tell me. I said, well, I could tell you because I like the way it sounds. He said, no, that's what I mean. He said, and this is the example he gave. I never forgot this. He said, you're like a baseball player that always hits a home run just by instinct. But if I said, I don't want you to hit a home run, I want you to bunt this time, you wouldn't have the discipline. You wouldn't know how to do that. He said, you've got to get the discipline, and then you'll really have it. So it's interesting because here I am, Mr. Jazz Educator. I was a wildly uneducated cat who had to pick all this stuff up. But in a way, it's a good thing because when I meet students that are like I was, I totally get it, you know?
Yeah, well, yeah. I think it's sometimes if you're that natural, then sometimes it's not necessary to know what you're doing. Like
Yeah.
it's Jerry Mulligan said about Chet Baker. It says Chet knows everything about chords except for their names.
That's true.
You know,
That's true.
and Stan Getz was like that. For example, as was Ira Sullivan. I knew Stan pretty well,
Okay.
and and he was very envious of somebody. He said, like he told me, I met Stan when I was 13, and he said,
Wow.
"Be sure you play piano." He said, when you're playing the saxophone, he said, say you got an hour, play the saxophone for like 40 minutes, and then go sit at the piano for 20 minutes. He said that he would have been better. Stan was not known for humility,
No.
but one thing but you see, people are humble with a 13-year-old the way they might not be with an adult.
That's
And
interesting.
and so he said to me, he said, I could be even better. He said, had I had he said he made the excuse. He said, I was on the road and didn't have time to sit down at the piano and do this. He said, but that didn't stop Al Cohn, because Al to him was his ideal.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, Stan said the perfect saxophonist to him, and that's been quoted elsewhere, but I actually heard him say that. He said would have been Zoot Sims' time feeling, Stan's tone, and Al Cohn's harmony.
Wow.
Between the three of them.
Wait, did Stan say that, or is that your?
Stan said that. No, Stan told me that.
Ooh,
And he may have been quoted elsewhere as having said that, but I actually heard him say that.
He said that if he had the knowledge, that he would have wanted to have what Zoot and Al had also. In other words.
Well, he felt Zoot had natural time feeling.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Zoot had the most, like Stan loved Zoot's time. He said,
the earliest known recording of Zoot Sims is actually in a film. It's one of these films for black audiences. It's 1946. It's an all-black band, and then all of a sudden, there's a saxophone solo. You take a look. It's young Zoot Sims in the middle of this band.
really?
Isn't that incredible? Yeah. I may be able to find that clip if we look for it.
I would love to see that.
Yeah, it's incredible, and he already, he's got that swing and that style. It's incredible.
I got to know Zoot, and we were at this festival in Nice, and Zoot was very complimentary to me. And one night we used to be up I'd run into him in the street at 2:00 in the morning, and then he'd say, "Let's go and have a drink." So I said, "I got something in my room." He said, "Your room's a mess. Let's go to my room." So I was only
That's great.
I was like 23, and so we'd drink all night in Zoot's room, and he'd tell me stories.
And was this in Nice? Did you say?
Yeah, Chet brought me to Nice to the Conference de Jazz, the George Wein concert, and we played all concerts.
Oh my God,
my
that's
first
great.
trip to Europe. The very first night I was in Europe, my very first concert, the trumpets were Chet, Clark Terry, and Joe Newman.
Oh my God.
The saxophones were Lockjaw, Zoot, and me.
Wow.
And the horn section was Kenny Drew with Larry Ridley and David Lee, who were at the festival as part of Sonny Rollins' band.
That's right, yeah.
But I don't think Sonny was actually, somehow they were there.
Okay.
But I don't remember Sonny at that festival. But anyway, Zoot was very nice. And I'd known Zoot since I was 16. I used to sit in with him at the half note.
That's good.
But so we're there late night one night, and Zoot says to me, man, you got real technique. You really get around that horn, man. You can get around. I never could get around the horn again. I said, what are you talking about, Zoot? You got all the technique in the world. You can do anything. You can see. I mean, I'm trying. I'm aspiring to be where you're at.
Yeah, yeah.
Mean? He says, yeah, but I got a reason. He said, the reason I don't have that kind of technique is, he said, I came from a very large family. He had like 8 brothers or something. It's just, he said, and we didn't have a conventional bathroom. We had an outhouse.
Oh my God.
And the only place I could get some peace of mind to practice, but I would go to the outhouse, be alone, because there was all sorts of things happening. We lived in not a big place, and everything was going on. So he said I'd be back there practicing, and every time I just started to get into my technique, into my closé book, or into my stuff, somebody had to go to the bathroom.
That's like the old idea of going to the woodshed. It's a little bit like that,
It
you know.
it was a literal woodshed.
That's
It was
funny.
an outhouse. Go to the outhouse to practice.
But you're right. My background is a very interesting mix because again, could be a long story, but what TJ did to kind of get me interested in the academic field, he said, "Why don't you study music theory with me? We'll do an individualized study in music theory, and you can work towards your master's degree and see how you like it." And I was still resistant. I said, "Well, I'm telling you, I just want to play. You know, I mean, yes, I do want to learn theory better than I knew, because even at that point, I still was doing everything, but mostly by ear, you know. And although I was transcribing solos already by then, and Prez, in fact, Lester Young, just because they were so great, I said, "Geez, I got to figure this out." And I started studying theory with him. And obviously, I mean, you could see it in my writing. I eventually got very good at theory and did a lot of advanced studies. And I went on, got the PhD. And my PhD was in music history, but it included a lot of music theory studies, music analysis. But
Is that
when
where
I,
your Lester Young stuff came in?
I'm sorry?
Did you do a book of Lester Young, analyzing Lester Young's work?
That was my first, exactly. Yeah. And again, it was TJ really who's responsible, not responsible, but who thought that when I presented the idea, said that would be a great idea, you know. But when I play, I kind of agree with you that I think you can over theorize your playing. And it's funny because I was talking, you know, Dave Liebman is a good friend of mine. We worked on his memoir together. This is the last book I did. I'm not doing anymore. What it is, it's Dave. That might be reversed. I'm sorry if it is, but it's
No,
called
no, it's
What.
fine. It's coming out
It
fine.
looks right. Okay, it's the life
Life of
story
a
of Dave
jazz
Liebman
artist, Dave Liebman.
with Lewis Porter.
Conversation with Lewis Porter. That sounds
Yeah,
great.
and actually it's a great book. I wish more people would check
Dave
it
is a
out.
wonderful conversations. You know, we did it on the real side with Dave.
Oh,
Before
beautiful.
Clark.
Oh,
So
okay. I'm gonna look for that.
yeah,
But it's funny. I didn't expect this because Dave is a very learned musician too, and I was talking with him about some of these young players that are into 12-tone systems and all this. He said, "Oh, he said, you know what? A lot of these young players have too much time on their hands." I said, "Really? I thought you were gonna say that's what you want them to do." You know, he said, "Well, when you're playing, you don't want to get too cerebral about it." So I totally, you know, that's kind of the way I am, you know.
well, I tell people it's like, you know, it's sort of like when you watch sports. You know, if you ask somebody, most of the players, sometimes you get an answer. I don't know. I just swung the bat and I hit the ball, and I
Yeah,
hit.
right. That's
But
true.
sometimes you get a guy who's like an analytical type of hitter, like they say. Ted Williams knew everything about the art of hitting.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, so Williams could say like, well, I had a feeling he just thrown me two fastballs, so I was ready for the curveball, and then
Ah,
so that's
he
what he threw.
he had it all analyzed.
Yeah, when the
Yeah.
count is 2-0, you know, and 2-0, then they have a tendency. That's when they're going to drop the slider on.
That's interesting. He
You
had
know,
it
so you
all
have that.
analyzed.
So I was thinking that that's like two things that I've gotten about theory, so to speak. You know, and I tell people I don't teach theory; I teach practice. I mean, when
Okay.
a
Yeah.
theory is something that's not real; it's a postulation.
Well, for example, when you talk about the way they teach it in schools, I don't know if most people make this mistake, or maybe it's not common, but I've seen people say, you know, you're playing the blues in, let's say, you're playing the blues in F, and then you go to B flat, so now you're playing on a B flat scale. And I say, well, then you've totally lost any sense of harmonic motion. If you're thinking of B flat as another key, you know what I mean? When Bird plays a blues in F, he's not on the four chord. He doesn't say, "Oh, now we're in a different key." You alter by ear. You alter the scale to accommodate the chord. You don't change to another key. Do you know what I'm saying?
So that
So that to me is teaching by theory instead of by practice. In practice, you're always, if you're playing a blues in F, you're in F the whole time, but you alter the notes of the scale depending on which chord you're playing.
well, that's why they call it functional harmony.
Yeah, well, that's a good
Teach
point.
people, in
Yeah,
other words, like if you got to learn a tune, I hate the word memorize. I'm going to memorize a tune. I said no, learn the tune in terms of function.
that's good. That's
Understand
good.
how all the chords are functioning. Bill Evans taught it. You know, the wonderful thing. I also got to hang out with Wynton Kelly uh, as a teenager.
That's amazing. I
Or,
love Wynton Kelly.
you know, well, a half an hour with Wynton Kelly was like 3 years of college.
I'll bet.
He would just show you, man, it all boils down to function. Like he would say something like that. You can use this, and it's functioning as that.
Wow,
And
that's
you
interesting.
know, and so Bill Evans also put it so beautifully. He said a song is a story
Oh,
about
that's nice.
a tonic. He said that's why they call it tonal harmony. That's why things are tonal. It means
Exactly.
tonic.
Yeah.
And chords either expand away from the tonic or contract toward the tonic.
That's interesting.
And every kind of thing that's tonal, whether it's jazz or classical music or anything, can be explained theoretically or harmonically by the expansions and contractions away from the tonic or toward the tonic.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, like I love you is in the key of F, and then all of a sudden it goes into the key of A.
That's right.
It
Yeah.
expands to a new tonal center, a temporary tonic, but it's
Yes.
still the key of 3.
And in that case, it really is a temporary tonic. It's a kind of a surprise, you know.
Right. So you have these things where you have a temporary tonic, but even the temporary tonic, here's the secret, is related to the primary tonic, because if I know that it goes from F to A, if I'm playing in an F, then I can play it in any key, because I know if I'm playing in the key of C, it goes to E.
Exactly.
I know, you know what I mean? So we
Yep.
understand that. And, you know, this naming the chord syndrome, like is one thing, you know, I mean, there are a number of things which I wanted to talk to you about in music education, you know, with the way people approach it. You know, I think what Chuck told you is beautiful. And this idea of like, you know, memorizing chords and naming them doesn't mean anything if you don't know the function.
Yes, the
So,
function is the most important thing. Absolutely. Yeah.
you know, I think another thing
And
about
I've also seen people, this is another of my pet peeves. I've seen people, let's say a Charlie Parker solo, and he plays the sharp 9. So they go, I say, well, what chord is that? And they say it's a C7 sharp 9. I said, no. The whole thing that's interesting about it is he played the sharp 9, but the piano player is just playing a C7. And so it's not a correct, in other words, you see what I mean? Sometimes you can think you're analyzing it properly, but you can actually be misleading. What's so interesting about Bird's playing is that he'll put tensions over what the rhythm section is doing. They're not all playing the sharp 9.
well,
Then it wouldn't be so interesting for him to play it.
right, but you have to understand that the sharp 9 of the tonic key is the natural 13th of the flat and fifth substitution.
Right.
So what he's using is the flat and fifth substitution and playing it as the 13th chord.
Yes.
I didn't show you.
Well, that's a good point. A lot of what he does relates to what we think of as tritone substitutions and flat and
Because
fifth
there was that
substitutions.
one statement that Bird made, and I remember discussing this. That was one thing I talked about with Albert Daly, with a lot of people. They said how these cats like Bird could say one thing about harmony, and it was all there, everything. Bird
Yeah.
made one statement, and you probably know this statement too, but I had it on my wall, and I didn't understand what he meant. That's why I put it on my wall when I was 15. He said, I found that by using the higher intervals of a chord as a melodic line and backing it with appropriately related changes
That's right.
to play what I've been hearing, I came alive.
Yeah.
And I asked everybody what he meant.
Good.
You know, and I finally got the idea. He's talking about voice leading.
Yes, absolutely. One thing
You know,
about Bird is on his worst day, he still has perfect, beautiful voice leading. And you can hear the chords that are implied in his melody line. They're beautifully done. And one of the things I think was brilliant about the late Barry Harris, when Barry teaches people these scales with an extra half step, you know, he calls them bebop scales, but basically they have an extra half step in them. What he's really doing is talking about voice leading. And what he's really saying is, even though Bird may not have analyzed his own playing and said, I'm doing a tritone substitution. I mean, Bird was brilliant. He could have, but
We knew
you
that.
never hear him talk about tritone substitution, whatever. Still, implied in a lot of his playing is this question. Now, this is the question, and you'll recognize this, Bob, that every young jazz student asks: where do I put the half steps? And what Barry was trying to show them is it's not random. You don't just all of a sudden add a passing half step anywhere you want. It depends on the voice leading. That's what those bebop scales are all about, is leading.
Right. You're targeting a certain note that could be anything from the third to the seventh to an upper structure.
Exactly.
And the half steps are leading you toward a note that's part of the voice leading.
But you don't just randomly insert a half step somewhere because you don't know what else to do. So
Right.
it's all about voice leading.
That's true. Now, there was a thing in classical music that fascinated me when I was hanging out at New England Conservatory. I'm a high school dropout, but I went to a lot of colleges to hang out.
That's great.
So I went to New England to hang out with Jackie Byard.
Oh, nice.
In New York, and who invited me to Boston to hang out with him and play with him. And so I had a friend going to New England Conservatory, my friend David Reskin, a flute player, and he had a roommate who was never there. He was with a show band, so he only came in for exams. An extra bed. So I moved into Jordan Hall, and I had to the point where even the people that had, when you have dinner, I told them I couldn't find my student ID, and they let me in. I'd even eat my meals there.
Oh, my God, that's incredible.
I spent a year hanging there. Now, what I did was people would talk. I was in the dorm, and I had a beautiful friend named Don Tarshis. Unfortunately, Don died last year. But he was a very brilliant kind of guy. He was studying composition. He played saxophone and clarinet, but not jazz. But he was studying with Robert DiDomenica.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And, so Robert DiDomenica and Joseph Maneri, who's, were students of a guy named Schmidt, who was a student of Alban Berg.
Oh, okay. Wow.
So they taught the Schoenberg harmony book. More advanced students in their classes, they taught 12-tone and aleatoric techniques. But they taught, the basic Schoenberg.
Yeah, because Schoenberg also has a basic harmony textbook.
Like Harmonic Stuck or something like that. It's the black.
Yeah, it's not about writing 12-tone music. Yeah.
Yeah. So Don was taking a lot of interesting courses, and he told me of one course that was there, with Ernst Oster was the name of the teacher, and he taught a course in Schenkerian analysis.
That's right.
And I tracked the teacher down at Ann's cafeteria, where he liked to have lunch sometimes, and told him that I was fascinated by what people had told me about his class. Would he mind if I audited his class? So I went there. He said, sure, come on in. And they were analyzing the Bach cello suites in terms of the Schenkerian analysis, which was basically finding the voice leading, taking a whole passage of Bach and reducing it to 2 or 3 notes.
That's really what it is. And for those watching and may not know about it, Schenker used the word reduction. And because the idea is that you can listen to a piece that's 10 minutes long, and in terms of voice leading, it might reduce to a few minutes of music. And then in terms of the ultimate reduction, it's just a few notes that are really the main notes. It drives some people crazy, but the truth is it gives you a lot of insight.
Right, and so I actually took his class.
That's great.
The better part of the year, and I started to do that with Bud Powell, Bird solos.
Oh my God, that's good.
I took solos that jazz people play, Conitz, Coltrane, and I found that, and it worked through all of that.
Yes, that's it's funny because just last year there's a music professor here in Manhattan at John Jay College, which is not a music school, but they have a small
criminal college, isn't it?
Yeah, it's criminology or something.
I watch Law and Order,
Oh yeah, right. But they every college has to have some liberal arts, and this professor, I can't think of his name right now. I'll think of it. Oh, Philip Ewell, Ewell. and he is on a campaign now against Schenker because he said Schenker was an Austrian Jew, but apparently, in keeping with the thinking of his time, he was racist, and apparently he said things like, well, Negroes wouldn't understand this or whatever, or Negro music, don't apply this to Negro music. So he's on a campaign to stop people from studying Schenker. But the truth is, if you take the ideas of Schenker, just remove them from the person if you want to do that.
Don't kill the messenger. Yeah.
Yeah, don't kill the messenger, because a lot of musicians, including yourself, apparently, have gotten a lot of insight, because what it enables you to do, as they say, is you don't want to see all the trees and not see the forest. It helps you to see the big picture of where is this piece of music going. When there are thousands of notes flying by, it's hard to make sense of it, and it helps. His method helps you to make sense of it. So I think it's very useful.
Yeah. So I thought, the same idea, the same thing with Schillinger, that there's like the books are like this big, and
I know.
but there are a couple of passages in just that absolutely makes sense.
Yeah, Schillinger, I never got as far. Um, I borrowed the books, maybe if I had taken a class in it. The Schenker, one of my graduate classes, we spent like a few weeks on Schenker, but it registered right away. I said, "Oh, I can use that."
Well,
But
he has expansion. That's the idea in Schillinger. I didn't take a whole class in it either, but I kind of messed with it. I'm a dilettante as far as that's concerned, but the idea of expansion and contraction
oh, okay,
of lines and of melodies. Like the idea, like for instance, Cole Porter. If you take a tune like "So in Love,"
okay.
he was one of those people that had a relationship to Schillinger too. He had
Oh,
course.
that's interesting.
I
I
think
know Gershwin did.
yeah.
A lot of jazz players. I mean, people swore on Schillinger, and that's why I tried and tried, but I just couldn't. I'll have
Well,
to try again sometime. But I couldn't find anything there that wasn't very basic and obvious, and it's 1,000 pages.
Sonny Rollins took a course in Schillinger.
That's
When I
interesting.
first started to hang around with Sonny in the early '70s, he was taking a class in Schillinger. So finally, I said, "Well, what'd you get from it?"
Uh-oh.
Then he said, "I got one very useful thing." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, the idea that melodies expand and contract."
Ah,
I said, "Of course you knew that." He said, "Yes, but not in the way he mentioned it." He said, like, for instance, he said a song like "So in Love."
okay.
You got strange, dear, but true, dear, and I'm close to you, dear. By the way, I
Right.
can't sing anymore because of my
Yeah, because your
my
throat.
operation. I had a tracheostomy.
Yeah.
But you see, the first time it's still very close. And then the first time it's "Stars fill the sky." Then it's like, "Darling, why
Right.
I'm yours till I die."
Right.
So you have an expansion of the interval.
Exactly.
And that music can be seen in terms and heard in terms of expansion and contraction. So it's sort of like some people are like one trick ponies, but the trick is good.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's like just the other day I was looking at Herbie Hancock's Dolphin Dance. Ba ba dee da, ba ba dee da, ba be da ba ba. Same idea, just added another note at the end.
And the
Ba ba
interval is
dee
wider.
ba. What's that?
And then right, and then again, but da da.
And yeah, and sometimes he expands, like it's longer. He'll make it longer. Ba ba da da dee. That's kind of like the upside down and stretched out.
Yeah, and then
So,
it more. Da 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 dee.
yep,
And then it closes up
exactly.
again. Da da dee da da dee
That's a
da.
very tightly structured song, actually. There's almost nothing other than that original
And
motive in
what's
there.
funny is it contracts toward the end. Most
Yes,
songs expand intervallically like that. That's "So in Love."
yeah,
By the time you get to da dee da 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 dee da 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 da, the song is rising
yes.
totally, but the intervals are not getting wider; they're getting closer.
They're getting closer and a little faster rhythmic, closer together in time also.
Yeah, you made me think
So.
of that. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah, so that's a great example. So I agree with you. I found I was a natural, it sounds like you too, for analysis. I found that analyzing music really helped me, and I'm so far from people that say analyzing something kills it. I never find that at all. I find analyzing, I'm also a film buff. I find if you analyze a film, if you analyze a piece of music, it only makes you love it more.
Me
I
too.
hope. I hope. Now, if it kills it for you, then maybe it's not for you. But that's the way my mind works. Is I like figuring out what do I love about this piece of music. But
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
funny, you asked me about Prez. The Prez thing turned out to be very important in my life because I did not hear Prez early on the way you did. I, as soon as I got crazy about jazz at 14, I believe I was 14. Um, And my brother looked it up and he said, "This is jazz." I said, "That's it." I knew I wanted to be a musician. Now I know what kind of musician. I went crazy. Ran home from school every day and I listened to the radio. I listened to Billy Taylor's radio show. He used to have a show here in New York, as you know. And I listened to Ed Beach after that.
Ed
So it
Beach
was,
is everybody's
yep.
professor.
So it was hours. And I used to take notes, which records sounded great and all this.
Me too.
And and yeah, that's great. And but I didn't get to Lester Young, but then John S. Wilson, who was the jazz critic of the Times, put together an amazing list. I got to give him. I finally got to meet him once, and he was not only humble, he was astounded when I said you were had a big impact on me. And but he put a list of recommended albums. Get this, it had everything from King Oliver and Louis Armstrong to Albert Ayler, Bells, Love Supreme, and Miles Smiles. Those were new albums at the time, and he said they're essential. So I followed his list, but I bought them in kind of a random order, excuse me,
Hmm.
because it depended what was on sale. So finally, when I was about 19, Lester Young with Basie was on sale, a double LP, two LPs. The minute I put it on, I said, "This is unbelievable. I can't believe I haven't heard this yet." The clarity, the brilliance, the phrasing of it. That's part of the reason I wrote an essay recently. One of my essays on Substack is about late Prez, because I say that there is great Prez in the later years, but if you haven't heard the early years, it's like you really don't know what you're talking about. You don't know where it's coming from. That early stuff is beyond belief.
Yeah,
So by the
Liebman.
time I met TJ, I had some handwritten pages of music notation. So one of these days that I was meeting with him, he saw this sticking out of my bag. He said, "What is that? What are you working on?" And I guess being a composer, maybe he thought I was composing something. I said, "I'm transcribing some Lester Young solos." He said, "Transcribing Lester Young solos." He said, "That would be perfect. If you do a master's thesis with me, you could do something with those Lester Young solos."
Oh, wow.
And again, I said, "I'm not really thinking of that." But he said, "Oh, come on, you're teaching here already. I got free tuition." And he said, "You'll get a master's degree. How could that be bad?" So it was only thanks to him, I actually have it here somewhere, that I did the master's thesis, which is analysis of Lester Young's style. And while I was writing it, I started uh, also writing for a journal that he put me in touch with called The Black Perspective in Music. And the things I wrote for that journal got widely read. And a publisher called me and said, "I noticed in your byline on the journal, it said you're working on something on Lester Young." I said, "Well, I am, but I'm not even done yet." They said, "When you finish your master's thesis, call us up." And that's why that became my first book. So all this is from
Who's the
TJ. I
publisher of
wasn't,
that?
I'm sorry.
Who's the publisher of that?
It's a Boston publisher named G.K. Hall, but it's been republished since. Now it's University of Michigan. It's
All
not
right,
this
just to let
publisher.
people know, because it's a great book.
And
I
the
actually, don't
And
have
the
it, but I've gone through it. A friend of mine had it.
oh, thanks.
It was really
And the
informative.
current edition is easy to find. This was the original, but the current is a paperback, University of Michigan. It's easy to find. It's in print and everything. So all that was TJ's idea. I mean, I really owe him a lot, and because the phone started ringing, people said, "Gee, it seems like you know something about jazz." Martin Williams, the late jazz critic, called me up. Now, you said about critic. This is interesting because Martin said to me, "I'm a critic. Dan Morgenstern is a historian." And I said, "Well, what's the distinction?" He said, "I really evaluate things as to whether I think they're good or bad." Dan used to do that, which is true. He started as a critic, but he said he mostly does now journalism. He does interviews, observations. He's not so much into, picking apart whether a certain record is good or bad. It's not to say he doesn't have his favorites. Anyway, that was Martin's idea. Well, early on, this journal, The Black Perspective in Music, I started writing for them. The first thing I ever published was a review. Again, it's TJ. I was teaching this course in jazz history at Tufts because I had called them and said I'd like to teach a course. They said, "You understand it's just a one-time tryout. We're not looking to hire a faculty." I said, "Fine." But at the end of that semester, TJ hired me as a part-time faculty. That wasn't part of the original deal. And so I said, "Well, I think I better find a textbook for this class instead of just teaching it from notes and things." And I looked at all the text. In those days, publishers, if you were teaching, they'd send you the textbook for free to see if you wanted to order it for your students. And I said, another time I was passing TJ, he said, "How are you doing with the textbooks?" I said, "I have all these pages of notes. They're all terrible. They all have tons of mistakes." He said, "How do you know they're mistakes?" I said, "I don't know. I guess over these years I've picked up some knowledge or some information about jazz. A lot of it is mistakes, what they say about the music, and I know that from listening. And some of it is mistakes in the actual names and dates, which I picked up at that point mostly from the liner notes on the back of LPs." He said, "You should send that to this journal. Write it up, type it up, and send it." Again, it was thanks to TJ. The journal said, "This is a great review where you compared 4 different jazz history textbooks and picked them apart." Sure enough, on the basis of that review, I got a call from Martin Williams to start writing things for him. And he suggested that I should do another Lester Young book, which is called The Lester Young Reader. This was the idea of Martin Williams. And the other thing that happened is the journal asked me to do some reviews. So I just want to mention this, you asked about being a critic. I did review a few albums, but as my career proceeded very quickly, the albums, current albums, it started to be some cats that I knew. And finally I said, I don't feel comfortable reviewing people that I personally know and saying whether it's good or bad. Even if it's a positive review, there's usually something, like there's one tune on the album you didn't think was so great. I decided right then, this was very early in my career, this was like 1984, I said, I'm never doing another review. I do not want to be a critic. And that was the end of that.
Yeah, well, I think that was a wise decision,
Yeah.
especially if you're part of the scene. I mean, it's, I mean, not just saying politically incorrect, but it's awkward. If you find yourself on a gig with somebody whose record who'd had an off day and you weren't particularly
Exactly.
fond of that record.
It's like you and I may talk about an album or a certain player on our own, not on this Zoom call, and might say, well, I don't know, I didn't really think this tune worked for such and such reason. But that doesn't mean I want to put that in print for all eternity.
Yeah, that was, there, and, there were some famous, infamous moments. And remember what was the magazine that Gunther showed up, the Jazz Journal? What was it?
Oh, Jazz Review. Yeah.
Jazz Review.
Yeah.
Where some downright verbal fisticuffs ensued in some of these things. A friend of mine has a collection of these older magazines from that period. And there was one particular controversy between Bill Crow and Tony Scott. over and Bill Evans actually. Bill had mentioned something that he really didn't like Tony Scott's music or Tony Scott.
Oh my God.
And I mean, Tony was my friend too, and Bill is my friend.
I never met Bill, but I did meet Tony, and he was a real character and a very feisty guy. I wouldn't want to be getting into a fight with him.
Yeah, well, Tony was a very feisty guy, also a sweetheart, but he had a,
Oh yes,
he had
absolutely.
a gigantic ego, but he had a
Yes,
lot
a
of
big
great
ego.
memories. He had wonders. Talk about a storyteller. He was right there with Bird and Billie Holiday and all those people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So he was, he was wonderful. But this particular thing, before I knew any of those guys, I read this thing where Bill had just said Tony Scott hired people and this and that. He couldn't really play and he couldn't do this and that.
Oh
And
my
then Bill
God.
Evans, in the next issue of the Jazz Review, came to real defense of Tony Scott and said Tony Scott was one of the first people to give me a gig in New York. He actually got Scott and Paul and I together, and this and that, and
Oh, that's right, because Tony Scott's rhythm section in 1959 was Bill, Jimmy Garrison,
right,
and Paul Motion, I believe.
almost. Yeah. But then he had Scott was in that band too. He replaced Jimmy.
Yeah, he replaced Jimmy.
That's how Bill and Scott met, was through
That's right.
Scott.
But the one that recorded is when Garrison was still there. I think
Garrison was the guy that recorded with them.
I don't think Tony recorded with when LaFaro was in the trio. But yeah, absolutely, he's the one that got them together. Yeah.
But anyway, there was all that. So I saw when musicians take it into their own hands, that stuff got pretty bloody.
Exactly. Yeah. And not everybody is forgiving. It's like, I'm still friendly with people that have occasionally, given me a mixed review or something like that. I don't care. But some people, they'll hold that against you for the rest of their life, So it's better to get out of that. So I'm not a critic. Now, when it comes to critics, as you mentioned before, most critics don't play an instrument. I would say it's very common that they played an instrument when they were a kid, like most people do, but that's usually not enough to give you the insight. And I'm always singing the praises of Leonard Feather because he was actually a musician. He composed, I think it was the first jazz waltz to ever be recorded. He composed the first jazz 12-tone piece before Bill Evans wrote one. I mean, he was kind of an amazing guy, but unfortunately, when I mentioned his name to journalists, they hated Leonard Feather. They all hated him. They said, oh, he only cared about himself, and he used to take gigs from us and all this, writing gigs. So you can't win, I guess is what I'm saying.
I met him a couple of times, and he was not a warm and fuzzy character.
No, apparently not. Yeah.
He had that British reserve, you might say, and then...
It's true, because he was a British Jew. He didn't have any accent, but he lived in Britain until he was 25 or something, He was very much a British person,
let me just sing the praises of the Lester Young reader to people as well. This is, if you want some insight into the type of unique human being that Lester was, that book comes as close as I've seen. I don't know the biography. I should read your biography of him. But well,
it's not really a biography. It's just those two books. The first book is really musical analysis, the blue one, and then the Lester Young Reader. The biography is kind of embedded. It's a collection of articles about President. It does cover his life story.
That's the beauty of what you compiled. Yeah. I mean, the article I love. I mean, I like it all, but the Bobby Scott talking about.
That's a great one. Yeah.
That one talking about his relationship when he was a teenager, hanging out with Prez and the warmth and the love that Prez showed him.
That's a beautiful one, yeah.
And did you get to know Bobby Scott at all? I never really
I did. I spoke to him. We met once and sat and talked in Fort Lee, New Jersey. He lived near there for a couple of hours, for like 2 hours or so. And he was a fascinating guy, and he told me these Lester Young stories. And he was very multifaceted. As you know, he was not only a very strong kind of a those of you in the Boston area, almost like a Dave McKenna type of jazz pianist, very crisp rhythmically. He toured with Gene Krupa as his pianist, but he also was a songwriter whose big hit was A Taste of Honey.
And he ain't heavy, he's my brother.
What's that?
He wrote, he ain't heavy, he's my brother.
Oh, that's right. He did. Yeah. And he was a very capable singer. He gave me, when we met, a pile of short stories that he had typed up in Xerox. He said, I'd love for you to read my short stories. And he gave me cassette tapes. I said, what are these cassette tapes? He said, this was maybe 85, something like that. He said, lately I've been working on some chamber music, and I had some professional musicians record it, and it was for classical guitar and string quartet. I got to tell you something, this was beautiful music. I wish I don't think I have those tapes anymore. I wish I did.
Anybody have them?
I don't think it ever got released in any way. So he was very multifaceted, interesting guy, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of a fascinating character.
Absolutely.
His one record he sang and he did all the arrangements.
That's right. Yeah.
So it was just, unfortunately, I guess he was one of those people, like somebody once described Chet Baker, he had a lot of opportunities and kind of was his own worst enemy.
Yeah.
A friend of mine said he just couldn't take yes for an answer.
That's a good way to put it. Now, you mentioned Tony Scott. I only met him one time. Crazy story. I'm in my office at Tufts University. By 1984, I was a full-time faculty. TJ had, I like to say he tricked me into going for a PhD because when I was almost done with the master's, he pulled me aside. He said, where are you going for your PhD? I said, I told you I don't want to go for a PhD. He said, but you're never going to get a full-time job with just a master's. I said, if you had told me that, I wouldn't have bothered getting a master's. He said, well, now you have the possibility of getting full-time. Don't you think you should get the PhD? Anyway, he finally talked me into it. I was full-time at Rutgers. Full-time at Tufts. Rutgers came later. Knock on my office door. Who is it? A bald man with a long kind of gray, some people used to call it a Chinese-style beard.
That's Tony.
He said, hello, are you Louis Porter? I said, yes. He said, I'm Tony Scott. I said, oh, Mr. Scott, of course I'm familiar with you. I love your music. What are you doing here? True story. He said, my daughter is here. She goes by the real family name, Mrs. Schiacci. Nina's, how do you pronounce it?
Yaka.
Skaka. And Nina's her name, Nina Skaka. He said, she's going here. And I've been living in Italy, but my dream is to be able to live here full time. So why don't you give me a full-time job? I said, Mr. Scott, I said, the music department is pretty much, this is not a conservatory, it's pretty much the smallest department. We have 4 full-time faculty, and then never, the dean has said in so many words, and this is a true story, Bob, he said, you're never getting a 5th person, so don't even think about it until one of you passes away or retires. There are no more positions in music. We're not a music school, on top of which we have open enrollment with New England Conservatory. If somebody's serious about music, let them go downtown to the, So forget, I said, it's absolutely impossible, Mr. Scott. He said, but don't you realize who I am? I said, first of all, it's not up to me. Second of all, I do realize who you are. Third of all, it doesn't matter who you are. This is not a music school.
He was also a Juilliard graduate. I don't know if he graduated, but he went to Juilliard.
Yes, he had classical chops. I said, you're more likely at New England Conservatory than here. He said, no, you don't understand. He said, I'm the loudest clarinetist on earth. I swear he said this. And I'm thinking to myself, does he think that if he plays loud, all of a sudden a gig will materialize? He said, let me show you. He had his clarinet with him. He quickly put it together, and he played a blues. And I'm in my office, which is a small office. He played the loudest blues you ever heard on clarinet. He said, now what do you say? I said, Mr. Scott, you're a great musician. I love your music. That was indeed very, very loud, but I do not have the authority to give anybody a full-time job, nor does anyone else on this campus. You're more likely at New England Conservatory, which is a music school, and they probably know who you are there too. So, oh, okay. And he huffed off, and that was my meeting with Tony Scott.
That was Tony. I had an argument with him one night on Italian radio.
Oh my God.
Yeah, he tried to tell me that my name was not Mover, it was Mover.
Mover?
Mover, yes, because
he wanted to pronounce it that way.
he announced me that I was playing with him. You know, it was a dual concert, and he announced the band. He said, and you know, my compatriot, blah blah blah, Bob Mover. I said, Mover, Tony. He said, no, Mover. I said, you're telling me how to pronounce my name?
Oh my God, that's crazy.
I said, when you want to change houses, what do you got, a furniture mover?
Exactly.
You've been in Italy too long, Tony. It's Mover. So finally, he kept going Mover. I say Mover, and then finally I said on Italian radio, I said, oh, Tony, fuck off.
That's crazy.
I fuck off Sciacca. I said Sciacca.
Yeah, that's right, Sciacca.
And I said, well, he likes his clothes too. That's a funny thing.
He likes what?
I'd go to visit him. I'd be in Italy, and he'd say, you got to come over. So I'd come over, we eat some pasta. And his wife, Cynthia, finally found a very nice woman. Okay. And then he'd have a stack of clothes. And he'd give me like a sweater and underwear and pajamas. And and you couldn't really say no to him. But he said, these are yours. This is mine. I want you to have this and that and that. So I saw Phil Woods. And I said, oh, I saw Tony in Rome. He said, yeah, I saw him too. Did he give you some clothes?
That's great. I love it. Well, you know, after Tony died, they did do a documentary film about him in Italy, because in Italy he's got a huge following, probably at this point better known there than in the U.S., unfortunately. And they asked me to be a consultant for the film, and what they had me do is to interview people, but they didn't include me. They just included their answers. But I interviewed Gunther Schuller because he was familiar with the classical side of Tony Scott, which was interesting. I interviewed Buddy DeFranco, who, by the way, was a lovely man, and he had very interesting things to say, because he was also very critical, though. He said, you know, in terms of technique, Tony Scott was very good, but I feel he could have perfected his technique a little more. It was interesting. DeFranco was very critical, and of course he was an amazing technician. And I interviewed at least one other person. Might have been my old friend Don Byron. Don I've known since he was a student at New England Conservatory.
I've known him that too, yeah.
Yeah? In 1978. I gave a lecture there for Ram Blake's class, and at the end of the lecture, a young man came up and said, this before I was Dr. Porter, I was still fighting with TJ, and he came up and he said, Mr. Porter, I really enjoyed your lecture. I said, oh, that's great. I said, what's your name? He said, my name is Don Byron. I'm an alto player, and I'm really into Eric Dolphy. This before he decided to specialize in clarinet, though he did tell me he played clarinet. So that was interesting.
Yeah, well, I knew him in the, I met Don in, I think it was the early 70s. When was this? This was
78, so
I met him around 71.
Wow.
Yeah, because he was, he was doing that. I would meet him at jam sessions. We had a friend named Jerry Adams, drummer around Boston. He always had, he had groups. He would hire always very good people.
He was a player?
He was a drummer, and he would hire James Williams and Bill Pierce, and
great.
They were still in Boston at that time, you know.
Yeah. Great.
And with the Tony Scott story that I guess I could tell you, that's just a quick while we were talking about him.
Okay.
Was I met Tony when I was with Chet Baker and we were traveling in Europe. We were in Cologne in 1981.
Okay.
And that's when we did these couple of records over there that I'm not crazy about, but they're that's all peanuts. They're live records.
Oh yes.
And
I think John didn't John. Oh no, you didn't have two trumpets. I was for some reason I'm thinking of John Eardley.
John Eardley, yes, we were playing with John Eardley.
I happen to like his playing a lot. But anyway, go ahead.
John was wonderful. I love John.
Yeah.
And anyway, I was kind of depressed period of my life, and I had been messing with some opiates.
Uh-oh.
And Tony came in to listen to us, and he would sit in the last set. So we'd have the four horns. We'd have John and Chet, and Tony and I, and it was nice. We would have a good time. And Tony just loved me.
Oh, that's
You're
great.
the best alto player, man. I haven't heard anything like this in years.
Beautiful.
So much of Bird and all this, and he'd say, "Man, we want to have lunch tomorrow." And I'd say, "Sure, let's have lunch." He said, "Good, I'll fall by your bed and breakfast, your little auberge, in the about noon, so we can get them before they close at 1. This is we'll go for lunch." So I was so out of it, I get out of bed. He wakes me up. I bring him into the room, and I take out a little packet of something, and I start to snort it.
Uh-oh.
And he goes, "What's this?" I said, "Not you." "Oh no, not you." And he
Wow.
starts to cry.
Really?
Yeah, he starts to really cry. He says, "I can't know." He said, "It can't be." He said, "You don't. I can't. I've lost so many friends to this shit, and I'm not. You're my new friend. I've decided you're gonna be my new friend.
Right.
Not gonna die on me. You
Oh
hear
my
me?"
God.
He picks me up and he slammed me against the wall and slapped my face and started slapping me.
Oh my
"You're
God.
gonna stop this shit right now.
Wow.
I will not have you dying on me." And
That's
you know what? It
unbelievable.
knocked me straight.
Wow.
I mean, I didn't. I mean, I had not gotten addicted. I was just starting to mess around with it. And thanks to Tony Scott, I actually said, he's right. What the hell am I doing to myself?
That's incredible. What a story. That's amazing.
Yeah, I didn't mean, but
Yeah.
when you mentioned, I don't know if we put this in the show, but we'll see. But
You'll decide. Well, listen, we've been talking for a while. Are we ready to wrap it up, or is there other
yeah, I mean,
topics?
I'm ready to go to movies now with you.
I'm not going to kid you. I'm a serious historian of film. I have literally everything by Orson Welles, everything by Hitchcock, including some quite rare items like, there's the Hitchcock TV series, but he only directed 4 of those. You have to know which 4, stuff like that. I have every film by Ozu. I have every film by Kurosawa, including going back to 1942. I have every film by Ingmar Bergman, including films that they never show in America, going back to 1946. In America, if they have a Bergman festival, it always starts with Smiles of a Summer Night, which is 1955.
But that one
And
about the professor with the kids.
well, I love that one. That's Wild Strawberries.
Well,
But
no, but before
people.
then, there's one of a professor at a school, and the kids plot against him. They do a very strange.
Oh yes, I'd have to think about that.
That
But
might have been his very first.
I don't think so because its first is 1946, and they never show it over here. But I have all of those, and the level is extremely high. The early films, so really terrific stuff.
You know who I've been into? Nicholas Ray.
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah.
And I just saw a very strange film about him made by Wim Wenders called like Lightning Over Water.
Oh, I didn't see that. I've seen most of Vendors, but not all of them. That sounds
It
interesting.
chronicles the last days of his life.
Really?
Film about Nicholas Ray dying. And it's a very, very weird and interesting film. They showed it on the Turner Network, and I taped it off of that. And
I'm going to make a note of that because Wenders is an interesting filmmaker because he doesn't only do story films. About half of his output is documentaries. He's very serious about that.
yeah,
That's interesting.
He's the one. He did Grizzly Man, right?
That I don't think is Wim Wenders, but
Who's that? I forget.
I forget who that is. But let me make a note of that. Wim Wenders.
Like Lightning Over Water, I think it's called.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Anyway, It's, there's some of this, Jesse. I don't want to give her too much editing to do. So you've also written some classical pieces, Louis. I just wanted to get into that. You have, for instance,
Yes. Well, this is a funny thing.
piano concerto or string quartet and piano with Don
I
Friedman.
do have some classical music, and it's funny because, as I've told you, my first love was classical. And again, I'm not formally trained. You know, I'm an interesting mix because I'm mostly self-taught piano player, mostly self-taught arranger, composer, but I did have some training. The same semester, I th- yeah, I think it was the same semester that I was in Chuck Mangione's combo class. I had private composition lessons with Samuel Adler, very distinguished composer who's long ago retired from Eastman School, but I think he's still around. He's about 94 now. And but I can't say I had any really formal training because that was more just, why don't you bring in something and I'll give you some comments. It was more that kind of process. But I just, having heard so much classical music, I mean, I can talk to you about Mozart, Crucial 333 in B flat versus 310 in A minor. I really know my classical music. In graduate school, when I finally was persuaded to go to Brandeis for my doctorate, I aced a test where you had to identify 50 classical pieces from Machaut to Elliott Carter, and I knew every piece. So I just knew that I could do it, and I started writing classical music. In the early 2000s, I wrote a bunch of things. I have a jazz saxophone concerto for jazz sax and small orchestra that Dave Liebman performed with a student orchestra at Harvard. You can see that online. I have a classical sax concerto for Paul Cohn. I don't know if you know Paul. He's a fantastic classical virtuoso sax for sax and wind ensemble. And yes, for my late Don Friedman was a good buddy of mine. So I have a piece for piano trio and string quartet. That one's almost an hour of music.
Yeah, I got to play with Don on numerous occasions.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and,
Yeah, he was terrific.
he was terrific. Anyway, this has been a wonderful time, Louis. I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. And any final thoughts on your part?
Well, it's a pleasure talking with you. Of course, you're not only a fellow musician, but a very accomplished, terrific musician. I've always loved your playing. And so, you know, it's nice we've gotten to know each other a little better over the past few years, and it's a pleasure to be associated with you.
Oh, thank you, Louis. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and an honor to interview you. And you know, I've always appreciated your contributions. And we're going to be doing a little special on jazz education a little bit along the way with a few people offering their opinion on that specifically. So I'd like to get you back for.
Well, that'll be fine. And in the meantime, I keep reminding people that I'm still very active writing, even though I'm not doing books. Just this morning, I posted an essay on the origin of Donna Lee, which you probably know is a Miles Davis tune. It was miscredited, but in terms of where he got the ideas, just a few last week I posted some never before issued outtakes of Sonny Rollins with Sonny Clark on piano. Never issued anywhere, by the way.
Really?
I posted.
I remember them from the Sound of Sonny record. You know, and
Yes.
One
Oh, you've been looking. Okay, you've been looking at my
no. That was one of my first Sonny Rollins records when I was a
That
kid.
was my first one too. The Sound of Sonny on
What
Riverside.
is there to say?
Well, these are outtakes from there.
Oh man, I don't know the outtakes.
No, you have to watch, and I analyze them for you, the editing and stuff. And I've put up about a dozen Billie Holiday essays, all with information that nobody has ever covered in any of the hundreds of books on Billie Holiday. I've put up about a dozen Coltrane essays, all with information that's not in my books on Train, which most people know this one, which is a biography and musical analysis. But I also have this big fat reference book, John Coltrane reference book. And but all the essays are new information. It's not rehashing anything. and I have loyal readers all over the United States, Canada, and Europe. So I invite everybody. It's a free read. It's just Google Playback with Lewis Porter, or you can Google Lewis Porter and put the word Substack, and it pops right up. You'll see it.
Right. We just
It's
have
a
been
free read
discovering
with
that.
optional. I have bonus items for people who pay to subscribe. You're not required to pay to subscribe. Yeah.
You know, there's one Coltrane story that I mean, you probably know, but I wanted to share with you, and may I thought it was a very interesting story that Ben Riley told me
Mm-hmm.
about how there had been a festival, and somehow I think Elvin and Rashid and Jimmy somehow didn't make the festival, so it was only McCoy and Train showed up, and Monk was the other group.
Oh yes,
Concert.
that was in Detroit. Yeah.
Right, there was and so John ended up playing a set with Monk, I think with Charlie Rouse and with Monk's present band that he had at that time. Ben was on drums.
Yeah.
So Ben said when he got back, a little while after that, he had a phone call, and it was John. And John said that he was going to go. That concert had made him think that it was time to change direction and to go back inside a little bit and play, in a more, that he might have taken the avant-garde thing as far out as he could go with it. And so he organized a rehearsal. Do you know this story?
Yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah, he had organized this rehearsal, and Ben remembered because it was on his birthday, July 13th. And I think the pianist was either Steve Kuhn or Al Daly or somebody.
Yeah, it wasn't Steve.
I think it was Al Daly.
It could have been maybe Al Daly. Yeah.
And and Ben was the drummer, and I don't know who the rest of it was, but Ben said he remembers because he left his house. He lived in Long Island as the train, and he got to Coltrane's house, and Alice answered the door and said, "John passed away a half an hour ago."
Yeah, something like that. It might have been that he just wasn't well enough to play, and then he passed away the next day. The actual sequence might be a little different, but something like that did happen. Yeah.
I remember Ben told me the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
And either I don't remember quite, the very ending of
Yeah,
it.
it may be that it was a little different from that, but definitely he was going to do something with Ben. And then I think Ben, we could look this up in a second, but I think Ben ended up doing something with Alice after Coltrane passed away.
He may have.
I think so.
But Ben thought it was interesting because the direction was going to be different, because Ben was definitely not a great supporter of the avant-garde.
No, not at all.
No, he was. He just wanted to swing, and
Yeah, exactly.
so
The one time I was supposed to play with Ben Riley, he got lost and never made it to the gig. And just as we were leaving, he came walking up. We said, "Where were you?" He said, this was out in Jersey somewhere. He said, I got lost. I'm sorry." So I didn't get to play with him.
Ben was, was a fountain of knowledge and information, and
I'll bet. Yeah.
He once told me, "Don't come in and burn us all out the first set." He said, "Let it build."
I like to hit hard, though. I like to come on strong the first tune.
Well, I like that too, and I like that especially I was like 24 and it was my band and I had him.
Yeah, well, that's the thing.
And
it's got to be your
I've been practicing all day too, so I was already.
Yeah, exactly.
I already played 3 sets in my living room. But Ben would take me out to Chinese food and we would talk about things, and
that's great.
he really, really was encouraging.
Yeah.
Anyway, man, it's been a real pleasure having our guest Lewis Porter with us today, and covering as much as we have. And so follow Lewis whenever you hear him playing, and whenever you see his writing and all the places he's told you to go to read him. I really suggest that you read. because he's very knowledgeable and writes with some soul. And,
I appreciate it, my friend. Good to
like
see you.
like to thank Jessie Kaiser for being with us today, and she'll be doing the editing of this. And we'd like to remind you that we appreciate it if you could give us a like, and doesn't cost anything to subscribe. This is at Bob Mover Jazzability. So on that note, we once again thank Louis, and thank you for having participated and watched. And we'll see you next time on The Real Side. Good afternoon, good night, God bless.